This is a lecture from Open Tuition. For the free lecture notes that go with this podcast, please visit opentuition.com.
In chapter 14, we deal with the nature and importance of communication. Quite clearly in businesses or in any organization, communication is of key importance. You require it for planning, for discovering what your plan should be, and of course communicating those plans to others. You need it for coordinating people, so that tell somebody there's an order that's come in for 1,000 units, it needs to be made by a certain date, getting in contact with the logistics company to coordinate the transportation of those goods to the customer. It's needed for control, perhaps to tell people that they need to work harder, faster, or indeed that they've achieved what they're supposed to be achieving, and so on. Negotiation, both internally, perhaps with your team members, or externally with customers. Motivating people, the whole business of the social aspects of motivation, the social need, if you like. Giving people praise and recognition is to do with communication. Training, whether it's a formal training course or coaching. And of course, counseling. You're talking through, you're communicating with people and trying to get them to communicate back. You might think that communication is a very kind of simple skill, but of course there is a theory to it, as to most things. And we have here a very simple pattern or theory about communication here, which breaks it down into various steps. And first of all, it says that you have to form the thought. So I'm kind of communicating. So I have to be thinking, what do I want to be saying? I then have to think to some extent what words I'm going to use, what terminology I'm going to be using. And basically that's encoding. And then, of course, I speak it. So I speak it here, the microphone hears it over there. There is a kind of transmission which takes place. It eventually gets transmitted to you through the internet. You receive it. Then you have to decode it. You have to try to make sense of what I'm saying. And of course, if this was a live situation, I would be getting feedback. I would be looking for either people nodding their heads or looking very puzzled, or maybe sometimes people asking a question. Now, one of the things we'll see that can happen perhaps at any of these stages is the step, if you like, or a step can be disrupted. There can be what's called noise. Noise doesn't just mean physical noise of some sort. Noise could be a breakdown in electronic communication. Emails, for example, could be that. Emails could go astray. There might be some problem with the email system and so on. There can be noise, maybe on the receiving stage here, which is to do with comprehension. Somebody says something you don't understand, that's a form of noise as well. And if the communication is going to be effective, it has to go kind of all the way through here without being distorted, without being subject to so much noise perhaps that the message doesn't get through. The patterns of communication that we have within an organization can be vertical, horizontal, diagonal, and they can be formal or informal. So if we were to draw a typical kind of organization chart for an organization, so it's going to be going kind of something like this. We'll just have kind of two main departments in it, or maybe the two main divisions, it doesn't really matter. But that's your kind of functional divisional structure there. It's pretty easy to see what's happening going on here. Vertical communication is going up through the scalar chain, if you like. So somebody low down reports the supervisor, reports the manager, reports the chief executive officer and the board, and then it may come back down. Some organizations are much better at downward communication. People tell everybody else what to do, and they're not very good at upward communication. And I think we've said when we looked at the tall, narrow versus the wide, flat organization, that this vertical communication is going to be slower and probably less effective and less reliable if there are many, many layers in the tall, narrow. Because every time it goes through a manager has to listen to it, and then the manager has to kind of retransmit it further up. There is likely to be noise and distortion put into that message. It's also important, increasingly important, that the upward vertical information or communication is perhaps more common. We said that it could well be the person down at the bottom of the organization chart, the new person with the up-to-date skills and knowledge, who's got something very, very important that people further up the organization should be prepared to listen to. And we need to maybe encourage this person to feel free and able to communicate. Horizontal communication would be effectively people at the same level communicating with each other, a form of coordination going on. So this person might be in sales, this person might be in dispatch. The person in sales has to communicate, make the sale, has to communicate to the kind of opposite number in the dispatch department. You have to dispatch 25 of these units tomorrow or something of that time. There can be diagonal communication. Diagonal communication is kind of going kind of from here and maybe to up there. It's just another pattern which is taking place there. And then we have formal and informal communication. Types of formal communication are probably going to be emails on the company's email system. It can be newsletters, it can be instructions, it could be memorandas, it could be briefing papers, it could be sets of financial statements and so on there. Formal communication is something really which management knows about and has a hand in, and usually it's going to be written. Because spoken communication tends to be a little bit less formal. Informal communication could be gossip, could be part of the informal organization, could be rumor which goes around the place, but it could be actually done by your manager. Let's say you're not performing very well. Would you rather have a formal kind of email sent to you, a kind of memorandum sent to you, saying you're not performing very well, you need to improve here, here, and here, and then of course you probably are right to believe that a copy of this email will end up in your personnel file? Or would you rather your manager kind of had a quiet word with you and said, I think you need to try a little bit harder there and so on? There's maybe no record left of that communication, but it may be the more effective form of communication which has actually taken place, because formal communication has, in some circumstances, got maybe a threat over it. It can be recorded, it's verifiable that it's been taking place and so on, whereas the informal communication is perhaps friendlier. Barriers of communication. What can introduce noise? What can disrupt the successful communication of an idea, really? Because really wanting the thoughts that I know about to become the thoughts that you know about. And it can be inappropriate language. Obviously, if somebody hasn't got very good language skills and you're maybe using very complicated words in a non-native language, is going to be difficult. But it's something that professionals have to worry about. Say accountants, doctors, engineers, IT people. We all have our jargon. We all have words that we know what they mean. If you're communicating this to a layperson, a non-expert, then the communication is not going to be effective. if you're using jargon, if you're using terminology which the person doesn't understand, and you either have to maybe use different words or make sure that you explain the terms and they know what they mean. There is status. Status can work kind of both ways. Imagine you have got a new recruit, been there for 2 weeks, and along comes, you're kind of passing in the corridor the chief executive officer, and the chief executive officer stops this person and says, "How are you getting on? How are you liking it?" And of course, the new recruit will be maybe frightened, nervous, and so on, and will be too frightened maybe to say anything very useful. It happens the other way. Sometimes the person at the top of the organization feels, "I'm at the top of the organization, there's nothing I could be taught, there's nothing I can learn for people further down the organization," and that's almost certainly wrong. Emotion. Emotion comes in, maybe particularly a good example is when you have an appraisal interview, and during the appraisal interview there's some criticism is made to you, and you're really kind of seething and angry, and you feel that this criticism is unfair and so on. Or maybe you're frightened of losing your job, and of course you just kind of seize up. Once this emotion gets involved, it's very hard then to listen carefully and to analyze carefully what is being said. It's the wrong medium. The media we can choose, there can be written, there can be spoken, and there can be graphical, for example, videos or something of that sort can be in there. And we might simply choose the wrong medium. For example, if you're having to have explained to you the company pension fund, and this has changed, well, company pension funds are likely to be very complex. And if somebody's standing in front of you, talking for half an hour, explaining a very, very complex set of rules and regulations, you're probably going to lose track or switch off. Maybe for very complicated sorts of information or message, you want to write it down. On the other hand, maybe, as I said, if somebody is maybe needs a quiet word, so to speak, maybe the right form of medium there is to speak to them gently, not make a big fuss about it. Whereas if you write out some complaint about somebody, it may have unexpected results. It may kind of backfire because this person is and becomes resentful that a more formal complaint has been made about them. And sometimes, rather than trying to explain how to do something, show people a picture. So if you're selling some goods that needs some sort of construction at home, they will nearly always come with diagrams. In some situations, you can look up maybe instructions or communication on YouTube or a company's website, and this will actually show maybe a video of how to install a piece of machinery, how to use a bit of software. Not wanting to transmit, not wanting to receive, two ends of the same problem almost. Sometimes you have a manager, maybe the manager is a very kind of country club style manager, very high regard for people, very low regard for results. Should really be telling somebody that they're not doing so well, that the results are below par, but is such a kind of always pleasant, soft person that the manager doesn't want to transmit bad news. Or maybe fears if I do transmit bad news, I'm going to be getting into a real kind of argument with this person, because I know from previous experience this is a volatile person. Not wanting to receive, one can have, some people have a remarkable facility for only really extracting good news from any message. I can remember my youngest child at school, and we'd be asking how he's getting on at school, and he would always be saying his teacher said he was doing perfectly and so on, no problems at all. And probably the teacher did say that about some aspects of his studies, but when you talked to the teacher, you perhaps got a more balanced picture of of how the child's performance was progressing. And finally, we have information overload, a real curse perhaps of the internet era, the email era, where there's simply too much information. IT systems can produce lots and lots of information, lots and lots of graphs and outputs and reports and so on. There are people who, when they're sending an email, send it to everybody. They don't discriminate. Everybody gets the email. It's only needed by about 1% of the recipients, but everybody has to sort through all of this irrelevant stuff which is coming to them. And of course, the chances are that in sorting through these 100 emails, you don't pay enough attention to the one of them which is really important. And the actual volume of information becomes a barrier to information because the important stuff is concealed and mixed up with the less important stuff. Finally, on communication, a researcher called Levitt looked at, again, kind of different patterns of communication. We've had the vertical, horizontal, diagonal, and so on here. But he listed some other forms of communication. And the Y shape is where you have maybe 3 people or 3 departments, and they're effectively linked a bit like that. So if this one here wants to communicate with this one up here, they have to kind of go through the middle of the Y and so on with that. You have the wheel, and the wheel is this sort of a pattern. The wheel can give very fast communication because you can go through this central node here. So if you want to communicate from here to here, then the communication is really only going through one person, only kind of going through the center, which is there. The Y shape can be not quite as handy as that, because what you can have in a Y shape is, of course, it extending like this. So if you're communicating from here to here, then it's going through quite a number of people who have to receive, think about it, and retransmit it on. The circle is like the wheel without the spokes. So this is the circle one. This is often a very slow form of communication. If you want to go from here to here, then the only way is kind of around there and so on. And finally, there is the chain, which is basically a linear method of communication, something like this. And depending who's communicating to whom, it can be a very long, slow, unreliable method of communication there. So the wheel type is almost certainly going to be the fastest type of communication which you have there. The circle is rather slow, the chain is rather slow, and so on. And organizations may have, it's really looking at almost reporting pathways here. And if a reporting pathway is too long, the communication is then slow. And one of the things we need about good information, it needs to be received in a timely fashion, fast enough to be useful to you to make a decision with it. And the longer the chain of communication, the greater the chance of noise at some point, the greater the chance of disruption and the message being changed at some point, and so on. And we have to be a little bit cautious about these slow, inefficient methods of communication.